Hi, and welcome back to the HE Enabled podcast. This is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. If you are listening to this before the 8th of February, that means you are a Patreon supporter. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening, and I hope that you find this episode enjoyable. I'm Kath, and this week I am joined by Lewis. Lewis is a recent graduate in graphic design from Edinburgh Napier University and is the founder and executive creative director of Position Photography, a company working in e-commerce and lifestyle photography. I had the pleasure of meeting Lewis a few months ago at an event last year, and I have been, since we've had this in the books for a few months, very excited to have you on the show. So I think it's time for us to get started. Hey Lewis, how's it going?
Hi Gath. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and for having me on the show. It's been far too long before we've got this sorted, but yeah.
Yeah, so you're, so for reference, you're Murren's partner who's been on the show before as a friend of the show. Yeah. And so it's been very much like I'd be texting her, like, tell Lewis I say hi.
Yeah, no, it's been good to keep in touch, and I've been excited to get this started, and yeah. It's like I say, too long.
It has been too long. Obviously, I know who you are, but please could you introduce yourself to the listeners and share a little bit about your background in higher education?
Sure. So I'm Lewis Bailey. I've just recently graduated with a bachelor's degree in graphic design from Edinburgh Napier University, and that builds upon my higher national diploma in visual communications that I got at the Borders College. And yeah, as Kath touched on, I have my own business. I run Position Photography, which is a photographic creative agency, specialising currently in kind of product photography, but we're also going into lifestyle photography and stuff as well. So yeah.
Sweet. As someone who's just bought a camera, people who make it into careers are incredible. I just run around and take pictures of birds and swear at them when they don't sit still. So you said that you've recently graduated with a BDes, which is a degree that I didn't know existed. It's actually pretty cool. Yeah, Bachelor in Design. So you've been doing that. I remember you mentioning you were a second year entry. So you did your diploma at the college, then you came in as a second year. Not necessarily conventional, but you know, as we came to see, I'm sure it taught you workflows and how that worked for you. So if you're comfortable saying, how did your disability neurodivergence impact your experience of higher education?
Yes, so being late diagnosed neurodivergent, my previous experience of education was impacted by the likes of sensory overwhelm, social expectations, but also a lack of knowledge and understanding of my needs, as well as kind of severe bullying as well. And so after my diagnosis at 22 of autism, I began my journey of self-advocacy and understanding and learning about how I work and what environment I work best in. And so how that kind of affected me. Previously, I was often kind of skipping classes to work at home, and I was getting more done in less time than that of my peers in the classroom. And so that encouraged me to kind of hyper-focus on the subjects that I enjoyed and was good at. But then after my diagnosis, and once I'd kind of, started that kind of learning of myself, I finally felt like I could kind of take that next step academically. And after being put off by my previous experiences and not understanding why my grades would be good, but I'd be struggling with attendance and social expectations, I had the opportunity to kind of go direct entry into second year. And so did that, and obviously with my new understanding of myself, though at the time I was still very much in the process of that, I thought that would be an ideal kind of enlightening and more comfortable experience, which unfortunately didn't really end up being the case. But with that new knowledge and understanding, I was able to kind of identify, articulate, and advocate my needs. So
that's really good. It reminds me of, so I was late diagnosed ADHD, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, part of that transition's always hard because you read all the literature that you can, and you're like, oh cool, I know what to do, and then you realize things that look quite easy on paper that you thought you were doing are actually quite hard. I found that with self-compassion. I don't know if you found it with anything else as well, but I always found that it was harder to put things in practice.
No, for sure. I think it's a challenge because you have to basically rewrite the script right? Like you try to kind of learn more about yourself, and it's difficult at first because you obviously don't have really a playbook, or it's literally like rewriting history. And yeah, it is a challenge, but it's one that unfortunately kind of has to happen. But you're so much better for it by the end of it. So
you said that you really struggled in kind of the classroom environment. Was that throughout schooling, just sensory challenges throughout?
yeah, I mean that was my entire kind of experience within sort of primary school through to secondary, as well as in higher education. There was always that kind of sensory overwhelm, and a lot of my time in high school, I was in a staff room because it was easier for me to work in there. And thankfully, one of my kind of favorite teachers in high school, who was very understanding, kind of gave me the opportunity to do that. And so, it's a lot easier to nurture kind of my education through that than it was in the classroom. So,
and it's personally quite wild for me because the one time that we met, and obviously it's a very different environment, it was a very different time. We went to the pub after the Amnesty event that I met up with you and Murren at, and like we were in quite a busy pub. I could have sworn you were in the Matrix. You were doing logos designs, and I was like, this guy, loud environments, seems it's fine, but obviously that obviously came from A, probably something you were very interested in, B, a lot of practice, and C, you might be wearing a damn good pair of headphones I didn't quite see.
Yeah.
But
no, for sure. Well, that's the thing. It's I thankfully have that kind of ability to be able to switch off in certain situations. I mean, yeah, music and a good pair of earphones definitely helps, but whenever I'm kind of overwhelmed, I do have those kind of like sensory defaults, and whether that's design, which I did have some work to do at that point, or whether it's just kind of fidgeting or whatnot, kind of having that ability to kind of switch off is good. So
discovering loops must have been like revolutionary.
For sure.
So next question. We've mentioned that you did a diploma, you did second year entry. Feel free to answer for whatever's most relevant here, but what was your experience accessing higher education from a disability and neurodivergent standpoint?
I mean, before we continue, I feel it's important to say that although my kind of overall higher education experience wasn't great, I am extremely grateful and thankful to many of my lecturers, peers, and the staff and support workers who I met along the way, as many of them were kind of truly trying their best to help me overcome a system that's unfortunately not set up for neurodivergent individuals. So yeah, I'll never forget the effort that those people kind of put into assisting me towards my degree, and so thank you to them. But yeah, going back to the question, I find the overall entry process quite tiring and intrusive, mainly due to the kind of level of detail that's often required in explanations, and because the information is often having to be repeated, as there's no kind of communication between SAS and the university, it seems, except for confirmation of granting an award.
Is SAS the Scottish body for?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the governing body that does like kind of funding and stuff.
Oh, it's like Student Finance England, kind of same thing.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so yeah, like here in Scotland, SAS is a fantastic resource, especially for kind of inclusivity and accessibility. But I find it baffling that there's not a kind of set of rules that ensures all universities and other institutions kind of meet the basic needs of all individuals wanting to access higher education. Currently, SAS offers DSA, I think it's Disabled Students Allowance.
Yeah, it's the same in...
So again, another incredible service for accessibility, but then you rely upon the university's own policies and support, which differs between institutions. So it's kind of a bit of a gamble to figure out what course you want to take, and then scouring reviews for kind of accessibility of the actual universities that offer that course. And so yeah, like with Napier, it all seemed positive. After my first meetings with my disability advisor and being onboarded, we set up a support plan, which was just a Word document that laid out kind of initial reasonable adjustments that I'd identified. And I was told that this would be sent out and reviewed by my lecturers prior to the start of term, so they had some understanding of my needs, like if I suddenly got up and walked out for some time on my own or something, for example. And so yeah, and another thing that seems to differ between institutions as well, which I think is quite important to bring up, is the acceptance of self-diagnoses. And obviously, specifically relating to neurodivergency, waiting times can take upwards of 5 years in places at the moment across the country. And so that can make kind of accessing higher education for self-diagnosed individuals near impossible with no alternative, and that's through no fault of their own. And so, yeah, so I understand obviously that it's difficult for institutions to accept non-professional opinions, but I would argue that the lived experience and evaluation of the individual who it affects is kind of more indicative of their needs and the reasonable adjustments that they require. And personally, I had experience with this when applying for the Open University as well for a different course. And that was before I was diagnosed. And at the time, they were unable to accept the fact that I was on the waiting list after being referred for assessment by a psychiatrist who screened me. And this meant that I couldn't access the support network aside from general support. And so, yeah, due to the wait times, in my opinion, a letter of confirmation of being put on that list should suffice for being awarded accessibility support for higher education. But once again, this is the luck of the draw and the inconsistency that's allowed through the lack of a standardized accessibility rule set. So
some of this is surprising, some of this really isn't. The thing that surprised me is actually it was the OU that was like not putting you on the list that they needed to, right? And giving the accommodations that you would need. Because I've had a couple of guests on before and it was basically like, you know, the work style of the OU saved me. It was great for me. But, you know, that's just surprising, to be honest.
I mean, it may well be different now. I mean, this was, I think maybe about 3 or 4 years ago now. So it was just before I kind of started with Napier, maybe about 6 months or a year before. So, but yeah, it was definitely. I mean, it was just there was no option for being on that waiting list, and at the time, kind of self-diagnosed, and yeah, there was a lot of kind of barriers put in place.
Huh? Because the other reason is that those guests who I speak about were actually there before you.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah. Some of them just finished up. But also I thought that, at least in England, I assume it's UK-wide, is that if you are on a waiting list, there is some requirement to give you reasonable adjustments. I don't think that's new.
Like, I think you can request certain reasonable adjustments kind of as standard, but with kind of specifically accessing DSA and things like that as well, I think that is where kind of stuff comes in. And obviously with DSA, it's not just kind of funding, like if you need, like, say, a laptop or if you need some kind of like noise cancelling headphones or something, it's also the kind of support you need in class. Like if you need a note taker, if you need someone to be there to kind of advocate for you in a group setting or something like that, like obviously that's all funded through DSA. And so that's where, without that funding, which is obviously through SAS, that becomes very difficult. But then the actual university's own policies did restrict what I could actually get from them. You know, I had that kind of access to generalized support, but the more specific support that I needed, for example, kind of down the disability advisor route.
But it's very much a matter of you needed the support, probably you lost out on the informal support as well as the formal support. The formal support I understand because it's tough because it is DSA. You need a diagnosis. So I get why you couldn't access that. You know, my opinions on whether you should have.
Yeah.
Different, but...
Yeah, I think that kind of hits kind of the nail on the head. I mean, I think the formal support, like I say, I think it's understandable that they would like that kind of professional opinion, but I think as well, nowadays beggars can't be choosers with the wait times. And I think that the fact that you have to be screened by a psychiatrist to even be put on that waiting list means that they are confident that you are neurodivergent. And therefore, a letter of confirmation about that from them should be sufficient for, you know, being able to get that support, because it's showing that you do need support out with education. And that's why they're putting you forward for that diagnosis.
And you mentioned that some aspects of, I guess, some of your traits that you have, just preferring to work alone, struggling with sensory input from classrooms, that led to some obstacles in your experience of higher education. I guess you overcame them by graduating in many regards, because I've had sometimes that is just what it is. But yeah, could you just run me through what those obstacles were like and how you overcame them, if you did?
Yeah, I think the first issue came after I'd been onboarded and my support plan was created. You know, I was excited for the start of term and I'd hoped that and thought that it would be different to my previous experiences. However, it turned out that none of my lecturers actually knew that I'm autistic and that my support plan wasn't read. And at one point, one of my lecturers noted in a conversation that this was due to having so many of them to look over because so many students have them. And so, yeah, this all came after having kind of experienced a sensory overload and left at lunchtime on my first day, as we were told to get into groups and complete tasks, but I couldn't understand what anyone was saying as everyone was talking over each other in a large room with different years of students, and my auditory processing difficulties ensured that I couldn't differentiate the voices. So I later spoke with my disability advisor and we updated my support plan about grouping, but already I was sitting there doubting whether or not this had any point to doing so,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, throughout my time at Napier, I kind of kept myself to myself, mostly kind of only engaging socially in group projects. But even this takes an enormous toll on my energy. It drains my social battery through extensive masking and processing. And I know as well that I'm not the only one, because some of my peers also were neurodivergent and could see them going through the same issues as well. And I'll add as well that, there's this kind of expectation from the lecturers themselves, but also the institutions for you to participate in group work. But there's not that understanding that, it does drain your social battery and lead to burnout. And so, yeah, I ended up doing very well in individual projects, but struggled in these group settings, not being confident enough to lead where I could, nor using my kind of knowledge and abilities where I excelled. Eventually, though, I did find my footing and had some brilliant group experiences where people respected my vision and expertise and I theirs. And this contributed to some really great collaborative results. But unfortunately, the social cost kind of led to autistic burnout, and soon after, my attendance began to drop. And then this was kind of when I truly recognized how inaccessible the system is. We were working on 3 projects at once with 3 separate days in the university assigned to each during the week. And that alone meant it was difficult to keep track and motivation, as by the time I'd be in a place to work on one, I was expected to shift to another. And so, yeah, once my attendance dropped, project management became so much easier, as I was able to spend kind of consecutive days on one project at a time, which allowed me to maximize my hyper focus and produce increasingly better work. And so I was kind of in that system where I could, work to the best of my abilities. However, I was met with another barrier where the online kind of Moodle portal, where our lecturers would post updates, timelines, class information, it was incredibly inconsistent between classes, from different layouts to what information was published there. It was really difficult to kind of keep track and know what to expect. And so, yeah, 1 out of the 3 projects at any time would upload lecture recordings, 1 would upload minimal text explanations, and 1 would typically not upload anything about what happened in the classes at all, or even the lecture slides. And so when I asked those lecturers for information about the class I had missed, I was told that I should have been in the class, which obviously is incredibly unhelpful.
Yeah, it's not. No.
Yeah. And, this was also during a period where I suffered severely from long COVID. So I had symptoms affecting my heart, my physical health, and my energy levels. So, yeah, I just can't understand why there couldn't be a baseline of information and consistent structure to the class portals with lecture recordings provided as standard, because it's just such a basic need that there shouldn't be any excuse for not doing so.
Yeah, I mean, when they saw you chasing this, did they see your attendance was dropping and ask if you were okay, or was it very much falling off the radar?
Well, I literally, when I say my attendance dropped, it dropped off a cliff. I was in one day and then I wasn't for weeks. And, it was really difficult to kind of get myself back into a place where I could kind of go back in and attend a class. And so, yeah, they were checking in and just seeing how I was getting on. And I was being honest with them and saying, I'm really struggling physically with my energy levels, as well as obviously the group work and stuff was very kind of impactful on that as well. But yeah, and so it was kind of a challenge to get that information from them. And, some lecturers more than others, it was very difficult to get any information about the classes. And, that also was more truthful of the group kind of classes as well, because most of the time it was multiple disciplines all kind of collaborating together. And so obviously there was 3-4 times the amount of students than there normally is. So, but obviously that shouldn't impact my learning to the way that it did. So.
No, that's frustrating. And because it's always hard when someone's attendance drops off a cliff. You have, on your hand, you were obviously really struggling. But then there's also, I'm not saying that it was good, but I had Ollie and Amelia on a couple weeks ago, and Ollie was saying how he basically went to 4 lectures in 3 years, 3 lectures in 4 years, 4 lectures in 3 years, one of those, because he was just like so rammed doing student voice and extracurriculars and societies, and it can be genuinely hard to know who's in what situation, right? But how do we make sure people are okay without being overbearing? It's such an interesting question.
It's another interesting point as well, actually, is like on the subject of like my attendance dropping and things as well. Another kind of barrier that was put up, a more kind of specific barrier, was they had added in these things called learning logs, which were they were across all classes, but it was mainly in the group setting ones. It was to make sure that people were attending the class. And I kind of butted heads a few times with the leaders of the creative industry section of the School of Arts and Creative Industries, because it was incredibly difficult for me to obviously do that, considering I wasn't in the classes. And the point of them was you would write like 100 words or so about stuff that happened in the class, and thus kind of showing your attendance. But also they would tell you specific things to answer in these learning logs in the class. And so if I didn't have any knowledge of what happened in the class, then obviously that was completely impossible for me to do. And they did give alternatives where I was just basically to write about what I had kind of been doing that week, because they also made it that they took up 10%, or I think it was at least 10% in some classes, of your overall marks. So it wasn't just like, oh yeah, we're just keeping like registration. No, it actually like counted towards your final marks. And obviously that was quite detrimental to someone who wasn't able to commit to being in the class. So yeah, sorry, that was just another thing that I thought was quite important to add. So.
That is really important. So your attendance fell off a cliff, but then you picked up and managed to build it up a bit more in third year. How did that go?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I say it picked up, I mean, I'd kind of, you know, I was there every couple of weeks, and that was kind of in the first kind of half of third year. Second half of third year, I only I didn't even attend the class whatsoever. It was just the information lecture about the upcoming term. But yeah, once it had kind of picked up at the start of third year, it was going okay. But then I had a kind of terrible group experience, as we just weren't the right fit socially, and our work ethic differed drastically, is the polite way to put it. And I was left with a couple of weeks towards the end of a 3-month group project where I decided enough was enough after we had a feedback session, and the rest of the group took nothing on board, and our provisional grade was a D. And so, due to there not being any alternatives, I kind of advocated for moving forward alone, which my lecturers were completely advising against, on the basis that they just didn't see it was kind of possible.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of work for a 3-month project.
Yeah, yeah, it was. In that specific group task, I think there was 5 of us, so it was like 5 people's work over a 3-month period. And so I ended up, I went on and I developed my kind of own concept as an individual, and I completed all the work with only a week's extension on the initial deadline, which was more than 2 months less than the total time we'd been given. But being third year, I was aware that the results kind of directly affected the outcome of my degree, and I wasn't comfortable allowing others to bring down my grades with their lack of interest. And as a result of trusting and having confidence in my abilities, you know, I ended up coming out of that project with a B. Just being able to work in, thank you. But yeah, being able to kind of work in an environment that worked for me obviously benefited me so much in that situation, as well as having or making my own alternative, I guess, rather than relying on them to kind of come up with an alternative. And yeah, obviously that knocked my confidence in others, and so I kind of refused to. But also, obviously, factoring in the fact that I can kind of justify the social cost as well on my energy, I kind of therefore refused to work on other group tasks and just wanted to remain focused on my degree. But this was yet another failing of my needs, where no reasonable alternatives were available, and only one of the group tasks across the 2 years had an alternative version of the brief for individuals. But even that, you were expected to do 2 or 3 people's work from what they were doing in a group setting. So it was completely unbalanced in terms of like how much work you'd be putting in the group setting compared to how much work you had to put in the individual setting.
Was there any way to change the number of people in a group? Because you said that was 5. Did they have briefs for smaller groups, or was it just like big group briefs? Here you go.
Typically, it depended on whether it was a kind of single class group or whether it was a kind of multidiscipline group. If it was a multidiscipline group, we'd kind of have maybe, I think it was mainly kind of 4 or 5 people working on that. The class groups kind of differed. We had times where it was just pairs, or we had times where it was like 3 to 5 people. But yeah, like the one that I mentioned with 5 people, that was actually a same class brief, but it was one of the bigger groups where we had 5 individuals. So, but yeah, the only alternatives were doing it on your own and just kind of, whenever I did do that, which it was quite a few times in the end, I had to ask for alternative deliverables because there was no alternative deliverables as standard for anyone who decided, actually, no, I don't want to do this in a group. And so, yeah, it wasn't great, to say the least.
So you expect to do 5 people's work, essentially, because you'd need that to get the deliverable. Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not great.
Yeah, because they were expecting everyone to come out with the same amount of work. And so there was just no, like I say, there was a couple times where, I'd spoken to them and said, like, look, I feel this is unrealistic. I don't feel I should be impeded for actually needing to go in as an individual on this project. And, when I did that and I did speak to them and was a bit more firm, there were certain times where I was given kind of, it wasn't necessarily like less work, but it was just revised kind of deliverables in terms of, yeah, okay, this deliverable doesn't need to be inclusive of this amount of work. But also there was miscommunications there as well. Like there was one project where we had to build, like we did like bookbinding. And so we had to like develop these little zines. And eventually we had to kind of bind them all into this big book of zines. And I kind of communicated, I'm not going to be in the class for this because I don't have the energy right now. I'm really struggling. So how can I adapt this to obviously kind of be able to do it as an individual? And so from what I took from the communication was that I didn't have to create this big book. I could just create my zine, create the outer packaging, and that was enough. But then I did that and I got marked. I actually like failed that module, and I was like, well, why? And he was like, because you didn't make the book. And I was like, well, my understanding was that I didn't need to make the book from his email. But then, that unfortunately, that module did end up just staying as a failure. It didn't impact my grade, thankfully, because my other grades kind of kept it afloat. But, this was the other issue, was because there wasn't that kind of standardized individual alternative to that group brief, there was a miscommunication and a misunderstanding, which resulted in me failing a module, which could have been a lot worse than it was. So,
and you also said that the briefs were quite vague at points as well. So what was that like?
Yeah. I mean, it's something that not only I had an issue with. I was told by many of my peers, both in my discipline and across the others within the kind of School of Arts and Creative Industries, that they were struggling to understand what was required of them. And when lecturers were approached, they tried to be helpful, but they were almost like too cautious. And it kind of came across as like for fear of influencing the project direction and outcome. But that's something I've never really understood, as to me relating that experience to the workplace. A junior to senior level designer would typically have a creative or art director who would guide them throughout the various stages of a project to ensure consistency with the brief and client expectations, as well as kind of internal expectations. Then also from a lecturer's perspective, I would imagine, it would be easier to mark and more efficient to receive 20 similar projects that are completed to a consistently high standard and accurate to the creative brief, rather than receiving 20 wildly different and I'd imagine often inaccurate outcomes where a student has struggled to understand what's expected of them through their misunderstanding of the brief, or simply not having enough information and creative direction to guide them to a coherent outcome that is completed to the best of their abilities.
And also, I feel like if you have vaguely worded briefs, that's like the easiest place where you can make something more accessible. Like it requires a little more brain power, potentially. But there's not really any extra financial cost to it. And this is what some consultants do. They go around and they're like, these are your easy fixes. If you're worried about budget, fix what you can first. And this feels like a dead ringer for that.
I think that's kind of the point, though. It's like it requires no, like, you're creating that brief anyway, right? So what is the harm in creating an individual alternative if it's a group project? And what is the harm in just giving it a little more substance to ensure that you get that kind of unified outcome? I think the worry, what I've kind of heard whenever I've challenged vague briefs is, it's so as to not impede kind of the creativity of the individual, and it's to allow them to really have their own stamp on the project.
Yeah.
But it's so limiting in a way as well, because if you can't understand the brief, then how are you supposed to actually work towards the outcomes? So yeah, it's. But again, like you say, there's no reason for not having that in the initial stage of actually writing the brief anyway.
Because thinking about it, even if you could make the argument, oh, I'm struggling to do an individual brief, that's, this is all more work, which I'm sure it's an argument some people could make. But whether I agree with it is a different matter, but it's an argument some people could make. I feel like even just making group briefs less vague would take not particularly any extra time or effort, which wouldn't be it wouldn't be a silver bullet, it wouldn't be a perfect solution, but it would be better than nothing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as well, like the group briefs were even harder because typically you'd have the same level of vagueness, but you're then relying on 5 people's either interpretations or misinterpretations of the brief. And then we're all trying to like come together and figure out what it actually means. And that in itself is a challenge as well. And the social cost of that as well is enormous.
That's just... I'm not surprised, but like...
Yeah.
Damn, that must have been frustrating. Honestly. So, we've spoken a lot about your academics so far. You made it through, you graduated, congratulations. Sounded like it was a time. Talking about other things like clubs and societies and initiatives that, you might have had going on alongside your studies. Did you have any like club societies that made a significant positive difference to your experience when you were at uni?
Honestly, I was initially excited about kind of the thought of joining the football team and also the design club, but my energy and enthusiasm was sapped that much by my experience and health difficulties that it really just became unrealistic. I was left feeling a bit depressed at not doing so, but it's something I would definitely encourage. But I also totally understand, given my own experience, why it's just simply unrealistic for some people. The other thing as well, going back quickly to those learning logs that I'd kind of mentioned, part of the learning logs was you'd basically have like 10 weekly logs, I think it was. But then you were also required to do 2 extracurricular logs. And that made up part of your 10% or more of your grade as well. And obviously for me, most of the time being like stuck at home, sometimes bedbound, not being able to go into the uni, let alone do other things, my grades were ultimately impeded at times because of not being able to do extracurricular activities. And yeah, I just thought that was an important point to mention as well, because I think that is so inaccessible in itself. It's just a bit ridiculous. So,
especially when these like grade parameters aren't developed by people with lived experience, you'd assume to the untrained eye that it's like, oh, we want to make sure our students are involved in student life. We want them to be active members of whatever group they're a part of, but that's just not going to be realistic for everyone all of the time. Even if, like, again, it's inclusive design. Yeah, if you're neurotypical or physically, or you don't have any long-term health conditions, disabilities, you can still just have times when you're tired, or you have something going on with your life, or you have to travel home for whatever reason. It's not just disabled neurodivergent students where this is a bad idea, to be honest.
No, for sure. And the irony is, you mentioned kind of inclusive design, and one of the group tasks was designing, and this was the kind of multidiscipline one that I ended up doing myself as well, and that was 5 different people's work. And also in that, because there was no alternative brief, I had to do 3D modeling and stuff, which was interior design work for a graphic design brief. So, it was crazy. But part of that was designing for accessibility and inclusion, which was the likes of having raised wayfinding on floors for people with sight difficulties to run their stick over and be able to know what direction to go in and things. And so we were having to have that consideration in our outcomes, but the outcomes being the briefs that were created by the lecturers, that there was no kind of accessible or inclusive design within them, which is just crazy.
It reminds me a lot of Sarah, who was on the show a while ago, because she went to architecture school and struggled to also spend time in the studios there because they were inaccessible over in Lancaster. And you're trying to think about inclusive design and you can't access the materials in the first place. I think it's getting better slowly, and especially now that, I think people are being a lot more vocal with their needs, or I hope people, at least some people are. But I get sometimes there's circumstances where you can't do that. I appreciate that. But it's good that they're bringing in some level of it, I guess, of mindfulness. But maybe they just don't have the people on the boards making these curriculums where this is even a consideration. And
well, that's it. You have to question kind of the lived experience of the people making the decisions, because it doesn't seem like there's any. That's the reality. So
let's pop on to the next question. So answer this however you please. No is a complete answer. Though I am aware that you are a big advocate for hyperfocus based on this conversation. Have you experienced any instances of your neurodivergence or disabilities proving helpful in a higher education setting?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as you mentioned, my hyperfocus on a special interest kind of gave me that grit and determination to ultimately get my degree. And, that was through the negative experiences within the university, battling them for accessibility. It was also through dealing with long COVID and autistic burnout, and also the passing of my grandfather, who, I was very close with and who was a big advocate for me. But ultimately, none of that was able to stop me from achieving my degree. And I thank my brain and the way that I work, as well as those around me throughout, for my resilience, willingness to learn and improve, and my confidence in my own abilities. But I have to say as well is that it's not often enough that we're allowed the grace to work in the way that we work best. And that's both in higher education and the workplace. There's a significant lack of individualism in role identification and project creation and management across disciplines. And it was only through rebellion and resilience that this was afforded to me. That's something that I can sometimes kind of take for granted, as there are others who either cannot or feel they cannot do the same. But the creative sector specifically relies on the creativity and imagination of individuals who are often neurodivergent. And so developing this rigid kind of structure of conformity and social expectations with little to no alternatives is an inherently damaging concept to the industry, in my opinion.
Especially in creative industries, which you're in, because it's like, we celebrate divergent thinking, and then you're put in these little boxes, and it's like, are we sure?
No, for sure. And, and kind of relating that back to like the vagueness of the briefs and stuff as well. It's like, this is what the way they think they can nurture creativity and imagination is by giving no substance to a brief. Whereas if you give someone a brief that has some kind of substance to it, the likelihood is that you'll get some really creative outcomes that are fairly similar in terms of what you receive, but not probably visually and not probably contextually. And I think that's the main gripe that I have with the vagueness of the briefs as well.
Thinking about it, maybe I'm just a F1 nerd, but it reminds me of like building F1 cars. You get really, really strict specs to build these cars. They still race very differently and have like these little nuances that make these big changes. But you remind me of a conversation I had at the Amnesty event, actually, where we met. And I was telling someone my story, I was explaining the podcast, and it was like, it was, how do you make it? And I was like, well, it's mostly spite and, quite a lot of resistance. So it looked at me and went, oh, that's cool. Is that an editing software? I'm like, what? Spite sounds like a great editing software. I want to get my hands on that. That sounds great. But
for sure.
So you mentioned how you need that flexible working pattern and how we need to spend more time embracing our neurotypes, which is, awesome principle. Completely agree with it. It led you to stepping into entrepreneurship. So you have your own business, Position Photography, and I was looking through the website. It's pretty cool. I've seen some cool photos of packaging I didn't know I needed. But the main thing here that I notice is it has a really strong basis in neurodivergent friendly practices and donation initiatives for uncollected stock. Do you think your time at uni shaped your ethical business practices today?
100%. I mean, I've always had this kind of ambition of building my own creative agency, but not necessarily knowing what shape it would take. The quote, "Be stubborn in pursuit of your goals, but flexible in your approach," kind of comes to mind. I applied that obviously during my time in university, with my dedication towards my degree and experiencing kind of the bumps in the road along the way. But those bumps and my new understanding of myself led me to owning, being a disruptor and, challenging societal and corporate norms to create an accessible workplace that champions neurodivergency and the creative individuals. And so, I see no reason for the sheer amount of barriers that we face. And so I made it my mission to kind of reshape the creative industry and break down those barriers.
It must have been so refreshing when you could actually look at it and be like, oh, this is actually working for me and I don't need to worry about much else that doesn't work for me. I'm sure there's stuff like taxes, but for the most part, I'm guessing it's a lot of it an easier ride than it could have been. And I think that entrepreneurs, some of them tend to be neurodivergent because we celebrate that divergent thinking, but either, for me personally, I looked at the job market and went, ooh, that'll burn me out. And others will want to express themselves in their own ways. So I was wondering if you had any tips and tricks for neurodivergent entrepreneurs looking to start their own business, maybe out of college or university.
Yeah, I would say that the biggest spike in my personal and professional growth kind of came with not just the acceptance of being neurodivergent, but owning it entirely. Once I understood myself and how I worked, which was a long process and that can't be rushed, but I was able to advocate for myself and found new confidence in what I do. And another interesting thing that I realized whilst at university as well, but it's kind of happened all my life, was that my confidence in my abilities was sometimes seen as arrogant. And on reflection, I would suggest that confidence is arrogance, either to those with little confidence themselves or who are jealous of yours, but to those who are confident themselves, is perceived as authenticity and ambition. Yeah. So to sum that up, I would kind of say, don't be afraid of who you are. Be committed to your to understanding yourself before others, and never allow others to impede your confidence. But also, to caveat that, I'm also not going to pretend that the transition from being a student to becoming a professional is not a difficult one, especially if going straight into self-employment. But if you have an opportunity, then evaluate it like any other and trust your gut. My own kind of quote that I live by is dare to be curious and be curious to dare. So hopefully that's a tip for people looking to do the same.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is that quote accredited to anyone?
No, so I think the first part, dare to be curious, is, I can't remember who by off the top of my head, but I've always just kind of said to myself, be curious of what this opportunity means for you, and also be curious to dare is the bit that I put on it myself, because you have to be curious and in a mindset of questioning things and trying to understand things to be able to take that risk and dare and be able to move on from a situation into something better.
Yeah. Thank you so much for running us through the entrepreneurship stuff, mate. I'm sure that will mean a lot to the people who need to hear it. We're going to just pop back to higher education stuff. And sometimes I try and end this podcast on topic. But if we had a look, we've looked at your experiences. And based on them, if we look at, other students nowadays, what do you think we could do to improve their experience of higher education?
Yeah, I think, it's a two-sided coin. I think I'll condense it into a kind of list of short-term attainable points from what I've said previously, split into the actions that both institutions and separately students can take to kind of improve that higher education experience. So yeah, for institutions, create a consistent baseline rule set for accessibility that is mandatory and accountable for all institutions and lecturers. And that's to ensure students receive the same adjustments and level of care no matter where they study. It also ensures that there would not be as much pressure on lecturers, as the baseline would ensure that more needs are met as standard, and that's adopted into their everyday processes.
And keep people accountable for that.
Yeah, for sure. And decrease the frequency and repetitiveness of self-advocacy by students through the creation of kind of standardized support plans that are required to be read and understood by lecturers and support workers, as well as, with the permission obviously of the students, to be shared between institutions and governing bodies. Because like I kind of mentioned before, there was kind of a lack of communication between SAS and whichever university it was at the time. There's a severe lack of communication there in terms of the students having to effectively regurgitate the same information over and over again, which can oftentimes be triggering as well. Another is to decrease the frequency and repetitiveness of self-advocacy by students through the creation of standardized support plans that are required to be read and understood by lecturers and support workers, as well as, obviously with the permission of the students, to be shared between the institution and governing bodies, obviously touching back on what I said about the lack of communication between the likes of SAS and the universities. Another is to adopt a standardized strategy for the acceptance of a letter of confirmation of neurodivergent diagnostic services involvement as a route for accessibility support, to ensure that those being failed by a broken healthcare system are not subsequently having their access needs failed to be met by the higher, or any for that matter, education system. Also, adapt group briefs to have realistically attainable individual alternatives. I understand that collaboration is a big part of the working world, but this can be nurtured in other ways, like, brief discussions or collaborative one-off project-related kind of group activities, for example. Also, adopt a one-project approach where students work on one brief for a few weeks with their entire focus on that, spending the same amount of time on each project, but without the disjointed kind of jumping between different projects on different days. Another and sort of final one for the institutions is allow lecturers to meaningfully engage with students through creative direction, and likewise allow students to draw from the experience of the lecturers to aid with professional skills development, and ensure students are provided with briefs that are understandable and clear rather than vague and confusing. And so, flipping that coin, going to students, I would say commit to understanding yourself, own who you are and how you work, understand that the system may be flawed, but you are the solution. Try to help others who genuinely want to help you, to understand through patience and kindness, even when not afforded to you. And finally, be unwavering in your commitment to yourself and your goals, but be prepared to be flexible along the way.
I love that. The only problem is now I'm going to ask you for key takeaways. I feel like I've got so much wisdom already. I'm like, oh, yeah, is it even, like, do I even need to ask this? But I'll ask it anyway. We've had a wonderful discussion. Lewis, thank you so much for coming on today.
Likewise for inviting me.
Yeah, I've loved it. One thing I like to do at the end of each episode is to take everything we've learned from today, kind of condense it down, and ask, what is the one key takeaway that you would like listeners to remember from your story?
If it's okay,
go for it.
I'd like to break that into two for students and institutions. So, for students, I think it's really important to remember that the moment can cloud the outcome, but the outcome outshines the moment. And for institutions, empower your students and help to make their voices heard.
Yeah, it reminds me of, for institutions, the report that came out last week for the annual student survey, which is obviously last week's episode. I opened that paper and it was called The Wall of Listen, and it was about 5 pages of students being like, listen to us, please. It's such an important message. I'm so glad you brought it up, especially because of how relevant it is to reports that have just come out and what's going on right now. So, yeah, thank you so much, mate. I'm going to wrap up and then
no problem.
We can go about our days. No, thank you. The HE Enabled podcast is the show dedicated to sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in UK higher education. Couple things. I'm looking for guests. If you're interested in coming on, please drop me a line. There is a Linktree link in the episode description where you can get in touch via email or LinkedIn, which I also use. And second of all, this show has a Patreon. It's like £1 a month. If you like what the show does, you'd like some early episodes like Lewis's, which was in early release on Patreon, then you can do that. There should be another episode actually coming out on Patreon the same day as this comes out on Spotify and other streaming services. So, if you can't get enough, you want some more, come and join. It'd be great having you. Yeah, Lewis, thank you so much, mate.
Thank you.